666.
Number 3, the Jewish Insider reports that in its first legislative initiative since its founding earlier this year, the Abraham Accords Caucus, comprised of members of both the House and Senate, introduced legislation on Thursday to encourage the U.S. to pursue a joint missile defense architecture with Israel and the U.S.'s Arab allies and the partners in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia and Iraq. The bipartisan, and the name of it is Deterring Enemy Forces and Enabling National Defenses Act, advances a priority of building an integrated air and missile defense capability among the U.S.'s regional partners and allies to ward off ongoing drone and missile attacks by Iran and its proxies.
Yeah, this is something about which most of our defense and security expert guests have talked about. Colonel Brad Gandy, who is head of USMIDM, Bilal Saab, Colonel David Desroches. An interesting development. I also thought, Richard, this was interesting, the bipartisan nature of this. It's not just hawkish senators here. I mean, Democrat Cory Booker from New Jersey is a sponsor. The legislation would require the Secretary of Defense to, quote, seek to cooperate with allies and partners to identify an architecture and develop an acquisition approach to implement an integrated air and defense, missile defense capability. It would instruct the Secretary to consider establishing a joint fund among the U.S. and regional participants to support an integrated defense architecture. Kind of cool that this is coming from Congress, and this does build on the Abraham Accords. I mean, you know, as incomplete as they are without Saudi Arabia, of course, it's interesting.
All right. Can I go on a rant?
Oh my gosh. Yes. It's a podcast. You can do whatever you want. Please.
Again, I threw this in here because it bugs the heck out of me. And I'll tell you why. So this is an Abraham Accords Caucus. By the way, the Abraham Accords I have no issue with. I think it's positive development in many ways. But this is the Abraham Accords Caucus. It's just passed legislation, bipartisan legislation directing the Pentagon to look into U.S. Air defense, integrated air and missile defense capability with our partners in the region, and that's as it mentions, we're talking Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Bahrain, Jordan, Egypt, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and other regional partners and allies to be included within this cooperative framework. In April, the House passed a bill that requires the Department of State to take certain actions promoting the normalization of relations between Israel, Arab states, and other relevant countries and regions. So it goes into detail about what the State Department should be doing. So let's remember, these bipartisan members of this bipartisan committee, especially the Democratic ones, would be strongly urging President Joe Biden to not meet with MBS. Yet they put in legislation that says, let's move ahead and try and support and mandate the Pentagon and the State Department to push normalization and, in the case of the Pentagon, regional and joint missile defense architecture. That includes Israel. All right, again, I have a number of questions. One is, would these congressmen support a joint missile defense architecture among the GCC states, which is something that the Pentagon has hoped for and pushed and recommended for decades? Or is this I think there's a lot of onboarding here with this, because what it would lead to inevitably is normalization of relations with Israel without Israel having to give up anything. If you were to do this, it's implicit or explicit normalization with Israel in return for their defense capabilities, in essence. No discussion of this outstanding Palestinian issue and occupation. And so as I go back, we talk about, I mentioned it earlier, the inconsistency, the logical inconsistency, the double standards. The same people are saying, no, you should not go meet with MBS, are saying, no, I'm mandating you, the Pentagon, that you should push for a joint air and missile defense that includes Israel and Saudi Arabia. I'm mandating the State Department that you should push for normalization between Israel and Arab states, including Saudi Arabia. I don't. It just the inconsistency, left hand not really being consistent with the right hand. It's troubling to me. And this is not to say that the goal is not has no merit. It does. In a perfect world, Iran wouldn't be so obstreperous and troublesome. But in a perfect world, there'll be a defense mechanism, a regional defense mechanism between Israel and its neighbors, that would work and everything. But there's reasons why these countries don't have diplomatic relations with Israel. It's because of their behavior towards the Palestinians for decades. And do we just move to the next step without any kind of recognition or concessions or any kind of movement from Israel on that issue?
So what's next here? The Defense Department's going to create this report or look into this. Then what?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's mostly posturing. It's mostly, and I'm sure the Pentagon is saying, "Well, yeah, we love that, but I'm not sure what we're supposed to do that." And these kinds of bills, it goes to the Department of State. And so, for example, the State Department in this directive, the State Department must also report on the status of normalization with relations with Israel, including information on 1, laws that punish individuals for people-to-people relations with Israelis. And 2, evidence of steps taken by Arab governments toward permitting or encouraging normalized relations between their citizens or residents and Israeli citizens. Now, I mean, does the State Department need that on top of everything else it's doing?
It does not. Going out on a limb.
But again, this is like returning to our one big thing in the discussion is, so much of what happens is driven by domestic politics. Our foreign policy in the U.S. has become tied inextricably to domestic politics, and you just have to hope you can sort it out and get a good result. But again, I don't, in and of itself, I don't have any problems with it. I just think the motivation is skewed. I think the motivation is to get Israel, relations with Israel and with Saudi Arabia in particular normalized. And that's the motivating thing behind here. And it doesn't, and again, as I said, by the same people who don't want Biden to meet with MBS, some of the same people. But, without any recognition that maybe there's an unresolved issue in occupied territories.